This is the land of lost hope, a realm of nightmare, a place of utter, unending madness, dominated by the Temple of Despair. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to the comic book analysis and examination series that I do here. Today we're taking a look at the 1987 4-issue limited series, Fantastic Four vs. the X-Men. And at its core, this is a story about trust and betrayal, of course intertwined with the overarching discussion of ethical responsibility of those who hold great power, which is ever present and recurring in superhero narratives. But foundationally, this series starts with the X-Men in a desperate position. That's because this takes place shortly after the Mutant Massacre event, and many of the mutants are trying to recover both from the emotional and physical trauma of everything that happened there. And what you need to know for context here is that Kitty Pryde was badly injured during Mutant Massacre, and at the start of this series, she is in a very critical condition. Her phasing power is completely ruining her as her molecules are beginning to phase and slowly disperse, so the clock is ticking to save her because pretty soon she will just fade off into the wind and be nothing. But our story begins with a prophetic dream sequence that is experienced by Franklin Richards, the son of Reed and Sue Richards, who has vast, latent psychic abilities, which Psylocke even comments on later in this same series when she mentions recognizing that there is a really powerful psychic energy around, but she does not know who it is. But that's all to say, this isn't your ordinary child's nightmare. Since it is Franklin Richards, his dreams are more than just dreams. And what we see is that the Fantastic Four are all dead, except for Reed. Not only that, but the X-Men are all dead as well, except for Wolverine. We then learn, through some twist of logic, Reed killed everyone here, and he is showing no emotional response whatsoever. He's cold and seemingly pragmatic. He then even kills Wolverine, strikes him down right before Franklin's eyes. And Franklin cries and he cries, and Reed starts to approach this journal, which will be critically important later, and Franklin senses negative energy in that book. But Reed opens it anyway, and when he does, he becomes his worst enemy. He transforms into Doctor Doom, which causes Franklin to wake up screaming for his father. So not only is this setting the stage for the upcoming conflict between the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and more, it is also setting a bit of an emotional trap here for us. Franklin Richards is experiencing fear and anxiety stemming from his nightmare, and this innocent child is about to be caught in the crossfires between two adult supergroups. Now, Franklin Richards seeks out his father, he gets out of bed, and he finds him, but Reed is in the lab working on something, and he kind of dismisses Franklin, although much more politely and much less cold than in his dreams, but it's still not a perfect look for Reed. He, at the very least, does sense something is upsetting Franklin, and asks Sue to check in on him, and she then uses her invisible force field to swoop Franklin up and bring her over to him. And Franklin tells her about the dream that he had, and this is another moment that emphasizes the power that Franklin holds, because Sue, in her head, is a little unsure whether or not this is normal child anxiety rearing itself in his head, or if it is actually connected to his powers and is emblematic of an upcoming battle they'll have to face. And even though it's past his bedtime, Sue gives him some comfort here and lets Franklin do her chore with her that she's currently doing, which is unpacking some old boxes that they found. And what of course is pulled out of one of those boxes? It's that journal that Franklin saw in his dreams. And Franklin is like, no, throw it away. But as we will find out later, Sue does not throw the journal away, and she instead reads it. Now the story leaves the reader hanging for a little bit about what exactly is in this journal, but for our comic book analysis and examination purposes, I'm going to tell you what it says. Because once what is in there comes to light, every member of the Fantastic Four is going to be so mad at Reed. So the journal starts out with entries from Reed from before they did their experimental rocket project, which got them their powers in the first place. And basically, the journal admits that Reed knew that everyone would manifest extraordinary powers if Reed manufactured the whole of the ship in a specific way to capture that radiation. And there is also further justification here for why Reed does this and why he says he can't tell anybody about it because they wouldn't give him permission, essentially. The basic argument, however, is that there are a growing number of enhanced, super powerful beings that want to attack Earth. They've encountered some before the Fantastic Four had their powers. What happens when Earth encounters an alien state that is against them? Well, that's a future that also requires beings who are devoting their energy to protecting Earth, and that is the role the Fantastic Four will play thanks to Reed Richards facilitating that, or for him seemingly facilitating that, because the one thing about this is Reed cannot remember this journal entry himself. He swears that he had no idea about the cosmic radiation, and he had no idea they would manifest extraordinary powers. But now let's turn to our merry mutants who are currently on Muir Island, where the wounded X-Men from Mutant Massacre are being tended to, and that is Nightcrawler, Colossus, and Kitty. Most unsuccessfully among them, though, is Kitty, who, as I mentioned, is locked into her phasing ability, and what she is referred to as textually here, to give you a better image of this, is she is in essence a living ghost. She can't even communicate without a telepath as a conduit. And Moira delivers some rough news to Storm here, the current leader of the X-Men at the time, who, note, is currently unpowered, and she tells her Kitty only has days until her molecules completely deteriorate and end her life. Just then, though, they are delivered a sliver of hope as Magneto contacts them to let them know that he has heard about an experimental device from Reed Richards that can help reverse Kitty's condition. And remember, this is the Magneto who has now taken a more prominent role with the team in Professor X's absence. This is him trying to be better, and not only that, but this is also Magneto trying to save not only a young mutant, but a young Jewish mutant. And both those aspects are clearly on his mind, and there's a moment later that will illustrate that. But this is also an important moment in the book that foundationally rings that bell about the theme of trust, because Storm is like, hey, Magneto, you've got a pretty questionable past with the Fantastic Four. They know you more in a villainous light. They may not be receptive to you. Is this really a good idea to contact them? But Magneto argues that Reed is logical and honorable, so in this instance, if Magneto presents himself correctly, then Reed should respect it. And Storm allows this, which also shows how far their trust has come. They used to be pretty mortal adversaries as well. Meanwhile, on Muir Island, Longshot and Dazzler are searching for missing fishermen, and they do find a man, pull him out of the water, and take him to safety. This will be relevant later, so let's put a pin in it for now, and cut to the Baxter building, where, as I mentioned, Sue has read Reed's journal, and now her faith and trust in Reed has been thrown into question, and as she contemplates what to do with this awful information, Reed approaches her, unaware of her revelation, but she quickly confronts him about it. And Franklin actually gets to witness his nightmare coming to fruition, and that's because he can astral project himself while he's sleeping, and he is there in the moment when this happens. He's a very powerful kid. Meanwhile, across town, Ben Grimm and She-Hulk are responding to an explosion and a building coming down, and they're trying to stop the structure from crumbling further and causing potential casualties, but they're struggling. Thankfully, though, the master of magnetism himself, Magneto, comes to save the day, and he was actually nearby because, as we previously established, he was on his way to go seek the help of the Fantastic Four. And Ben Grimm here is immediately skeptical about Magneto helping them, saying that he probably even blew the place up himself. And funny enough, She-Hulk and Ben were just talking about Magneto right before this, and his past trial that went unfinished, with She-Hulk saying it's less black and white than one might think, and Ben clinging to the belief that once a villain, always a villain. And again, Magneto has been on his redemption path, but do his past actions overshadow his current intentions? Is that skepticism that Ben and others in this series will have valid? And that is this idea that our worst actions define us being challenged here. And if we do inherently allow that, ignoring our biases and preconceived notions, is the world better for it or worse? Obviously, this is a fantastical story, and it's involving characters that we love, so this is going to be approached more idealistically, but I think it's still really interesting subject matter. But they're able to stop the building from collapsing further with also the help of Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, who also shows up and displays some confusion about why Magneto's helping them, but they all go to the Baxter building eventually, and Magneto makes his plea for help, to which Reed basically responds with, "Why should we trust you?" And eventually this leads to Magneto stating, "How can I prove that I'm trustworthy unless you trust me?" Which is the classic paradox of trust, which Magneto is caught in, because he can't demonstrate how he's changed without others having some faith that he has. But more importantly, Magneto shifts the focus from himself and says, "Hey, this is for Shadowcat, not me, and she has never hurt you." So Magneto isn't saying he's blameless in the mistrust placed upon him, but he continues to urge Reed to help because a true innocent life is at stake. Now Reed is dealing with this potential major family issue of his journal and is hesitant to offer his help at first, but ultimately he says he will help. And this is also a strong moment to showcase that their collective actions have broader implications that transcend their personal character histories, and they are aware of that. So the Fantastic Four and Magneto make their way to Muir Island with Reed's device that could potentially save Kitty, and while everyone is awaiting Reed to fix Kitty, he hangs back on the ship they arrived in, and he is just suffocating in self-doubt about how he could possibly make another major mistake like he did when the Fantastic Four first got their powers. A mistake that hurt the people he cared most about. And really, he is thinking that he's stuck in a lose-lose situation. What if he tries to help and his arrogance kills Kitty? But also, what if he's too cautious and his inaction kills Kitty? But regardless, he gets off the ship eventually, ready to go to work and do the foundational checkup of Kitty to see her current status. And as he does this, he walks by everyone, just completely ignoring them, which everyone notices and is like, what is up with this dude? And Wolverine also is immediately sensing bad energy from him, and he is put on edge now. Later that day, Reed delivers the news to the X-Men. There is nothing he can do to help Kitty. Obviously, this upsets the team, and Magneto calls out Reed's fear to go through with the process, and he then exerts his force and uses his powers to grab the machine himself so that the X-Men can just run the process themselves. But She-Hulk quickly stops him and says, "Hey, let's be rational and talk this out instead." To be honest though, a lot of these characters are really used to solving their problems through fighting over communication, and because of that, some of their muscles when it comes to conflict resolution via communication are lacking. The hot-headed Johnny Storm, for instance, sees Magneto's power and immediately wants to take action, so he flames up, and now Wolverine is fully actionized and ready to fight, and he takes care of Johnny real quick. And then Wolverine is about to face off against Reed Richards as the astral projection of Franklin Richards watches, unable to stop the very events from his dream from playing out. And Wolverine is now just trying to beat Reed into submission so that he'll help Kitty, but Reed is able to keep himself uncut by Wolverine's blades by wrapping his elastic body around him and entangling him. Storm, being a responsible leader, tries to stop the fighting, but she's a bit limited in what she can do, at least physically, without her powers, so Magneto offers to separate them, and I don't know what he was gonna do here, if he was gonna like pull Wolverine off using the adamantium in his bones, but Ben Grimm, remembering the villain that Magneto is, doesn't even allow this to happen. He immediately claps his rock hands together hard, generating a shockwave that temporarily stuns Magneto. Storm, however, is able to avoid that, and she grabs Wolverine by the wrist, and at this point, the Human Torch has fully recovered from Wolverine's hit, sees Storm, Reed, and Wolverine struggling, flames on, and he hurts Storm. He singes her instead of his target Wolverine. Now again, she has no powers right now. That means she's much less resilient, and this really does hurt her just like it would hurt any other human. Then we get Rogue entering the fight. She sweeps up Ben Grimm, kisses him, absorbs his powers and psyche temporarily, and I love the way the prose is written here. It just beautifully captures the pain of Rogue's powers and how she has to utilize them, and it also calls out that Ben is such a sincere and beautiful individual on the inside as she gets some insight into his psyche. And while that's going on, the Human Torch is taken out for the second time in this fight by none other than the telepathic prowess of Psylocke. And Psylocke senses that really Wolverine started this fight, so she makes an attempt to calm calm his mind while also splitting her abilities so she can soothe Storm's pain. But man, they're having trouble getting Wolverine under control. He really cares about Kitty and seemingly is willing to lose a lot to help her, even if his help isn't very helpful. And again, Franklin is watching all of this from his astral form, but can do nothing to stop it. No one can hear his pleas. This anxiety wakes him up back at his home though, and Sue comes to comfort him, and he fills her in on what he saw. And then we get this nice character moment where Sue laments about the cosmic rays and how through her they have affected Franklin, since that's why he has powers and has to suffer these dreams. Then she starts thinking more and more about Reed's journal, and she has this cathartic power outburst to show us her internalized pain externalized. But how does the fight between the X-Men and Fantastic Four actually end? Well, Moira McTaggart gets in Wolverine's way to defend Reed, which, funny, given the Moira retcon, how close was Wolverine to just ending this timeline right here? But anyway, Storm also gets in the way and shares the sentiment that if you want to get to Reed, you'll have to kill me. And Wolverine could easily bypass these two right now, but he respects Storm so much and he now has a moment to think clearer and he steps down. And Storm asks Reed again, but he still says that he can't help. Rogue, still having consumed the Thing's powers, pulls a Magneto similarity here and also says, hey, let's just take what we want. I'll touch Reed and have all his knowledge. But Storm puts a stop to that even though she wants to as well, but it's not the right way to do things. And just as the Fantastic Four are getting ready to head out, remember that fisherman from earlier? Well, turns out it wasn't quite a fisherman, but actually a Doom bot. And that bot projects the actual Dr. Doom image to everyone, and Doom basically offers to help out the X-Men since Reed won't do it. And obviously Doom has his own villainous past, and the X-Men ask what the price for his help would be, but Doom says he has no price and he's doing it for reasons of his own. Again, trust. Can Dr. Doom be trusted? Must he be trusted in such a dire situation? Well, Reed, for one, begs them not to consider it, and the X-Men are honestly quite funny here because they're like, you're still here, Reed? Get out of here. Whatever we decide is our decision alone. You didn't want to help, remember? And if you're wondering how Storm was able to still lead while being pretty critically injured, by the way, well, as soon as the Fantastic Four left, she immediately faints. And Kitty gets a front row seat to seeing Storm in the infirmary, and we get this very dark and foreboding thought from her about how she doesn't want to live if it means the X-Men have to lose their souls in the process. And this is setting us up for a really emotionally compelling scene later on, but meanwhile, Reed has returned to the Baxter building and his day is about to go from bad to worse because Ben Grimm grabs him and starts demanding some answers. It's clear now that he's read the journal, and if anybody has a right to be angry if Reed did intentionally cause their powers, it definitely is Ben. He lost the most. But it turns out everybody in the Fantastic Four now knows, not just Ben and Sue, and they are ready to confront him about it as a family. And this is where the story actually tells us what the journal says, but since I went over that earlier, we can cut to the aftermath of Reed pleading with his team not to believe what's written in that journal. But it wouldn't be completely out of character for Reed to take a utilitarian action like that, so the trust is fractured. And basically, they all leave Reed, disappointed and ashamed of him. Only Sue lingers for a moment, but eventually she goes to bed, hurt and in pain from the apparent betrayal of the man she loves most. And while that's going on, in parallel, the X-Men are having their own family discussion about whether or not to allow Doom to help, and ultimately they're faced with this dilemma of what matters more, them accepting help from this villain where there may be unintended consequences attached, or letting Kitty die. That's the alternative. And ultimately, the X-Men decide to risk it for Kitty, united in the decision at the very least, and very understandably. We open our next issue with the X-Men in Latveria seeking Doom's help, and Doom also helps Storm recover from her injuries from the Human Torch. And most of the X-Men are hating every minute there though, and Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc even have this interesting conversation about, hey, well maybe Doom is just doing good to do good. Not long ago Magneto was the X-Men's greatest enemy and now he runs the school. But at that moment Rogue is flying back to Doom's castle after doing some Latverian shopping, and the Doom bots guarding the perimeter clock her as a threat and a tack. And they fight these Doom bots
thoughts for a bit together until eventually a rejuvenated Storm comes and puts an end to it. But what about Kitty? We honestly haven't seen too much of her yet in a story that is put into motion through her character. And again, we see Kitty 1, really deteriorating, and 2, grappling with this idea of wanting to live but not at the cost of putting the X-Men in debt of someone like Dr. Doom. And with that thought, Kitty uses all of her strength to free herself from the life support system that she's currently attached to that is keeping her alive, and guess who's there to witness that? The astral projection of Franklin Richards. And Kitty floats out onto the ledge of this tower she's in, and we get insight into her thoughts here and her plan. She's going to wait until the sunrise, and then relax her concentration, letting her molecules float off into the wind, which would be the effective end of Kitty Pryde. Now, this is one of the most emotionally charged moments of this story for me. Franklin begins crying and reaching out to Kitty, pleading for her not to go through with her plan, mentioning all of the people who would miss her terribly, her parents, the X-Men, everyone who's ever loved her, and Lockheed, Kitty's companion little dragon, also sees this and lets out a roar that alerts the X-Men. And Psylocke then uses her telepathic abilities to check in and see what Kitty is doing, and Kitty just sounds absolutely hopeless and defeated here, 100% intending to go through with her plan. And poor Franklin keeps crying out, begging for Kitty to take his hand, and he promises that his dream won't come true, the X-Men won't die, his family will get along, and Franklin is just letting out a lot of his childhood frustrations here. God, what a beautiful page of Kitty finally noticing Franklin, and then we get this sad, contemplative look on her face. And then finally the X-Men arrive at the top of the tower, and we see Kitty is back in her life support device, Franklin having saved her from a terrible ending. Meanwhile, Reed Richards is grappling with his own demons. As a leader of the Fantastic Four, Reed has always been a pillar of strength and rationality, but this growing fear that his ego and scientific curiosity that may overshadow his ethical considerations or even just candidly lead to a disastrous scenario is causing him to drown in self-doubt. Reed knows he didn't cause their powers, but is it just his subconscious mind blocking that out? And as Reed thinks about how his family has lost faith in him, and really how he's lost some faith in himself, he visits Franklin's room and notices him having a bad dream. Of course, this is actually Franklin experiencing the scenario we just saw, and when Franklin does wake up, he hugs his dad, he says he's glad he's there, and it's just this other great tender moment. Claremont really utilizing Franklin like an emotional hammer, beating the nail on the head again and again, and I love it, it gets me. And then we get this super sweet scene of Reed telling Franklin a bedtime story, and he's using his powers to do puppetry, and Sue catches this, shifts into her invisible form and watches, and it's a reminder to her about the gentleness in Reed's heart, and that anger she was holding starts to fade away after seeing that. But what about the other members of the Fantastic Four? Well, Ben Grimm is out drinking his troubles away, deeply thinking about the nature of this situation and the rock shell that he's trapped in because of it, and worse, that his best friend might have done this to him on purpose. And as he's walking home angry at Reed, Ben comes across a car wreck with a baby still trapped inside a burning vehicle. And for a guy who's gone against Galactus, this is no big deal. The thing rips open the car, saves the baby, and delivers the baby into the hands of a very grateful mother. And this lightens Ben's perspective a little bit. That's a life that would have likely been lost if he wasn't the way he is. For the Human Torch, we see him practicing his flight and flame precision at a pier, clearly racked with guilt about hurting Storm. And this is tough for Johnny. He wants to make things right, he wants to make up for it, but normally he'd turn to Reed for advice in a situation like this. But as Johnny says, and again hitting our theme, how can he trust anything Reed says? But as Johnny talks to Alicia, he mentions that it's hard to hate Reed for it if it's true though, since becoming the Human Torch is the best thing that ever happened to him. He was a kid, kind of going down the wrong road when it happened, and now he's a hero who's seen the stars and galaxies that most couldn't ever dream of. And Alicia provides Johnny comfort here, saying that he's not a kid anymore, and he faces his mistakes and he tries to do better and deal with the consequences, and that's what growing is all about. And back in the Baxter building, we learn that Sue is really forgiving Reed, and she says the man she just witnessed with Franklin could not be the analytical monster that was depicted in that journal. It couldn't be her Reed. But Reed still is faced with an issue. Why can't he help Kitty? What's the mental block stopping him? Well, he's so scared of this unintended tragic consequence, and as they're discussing that, Johnny and Ben enter the room with Franklin, smiles on their faces, having each in a small way conquered their internal dilemmas and ready to be a team, and more than that, a family again. With that, we enter our final act of the story. It's time for Doom to save Kitty, and the anxiety of the whole situation is really getting to Kitty. I mean, she's just a kid, and she's been through so much now, and her life hangs in the balance, and her only seeming savior is the exact type of villain that the X-Men would normally take down. And as she's going down that dark thought rabbit hole again, Franklin astral projects back into the room, and Franklin is really excited to let Kitty know that Reed Richards is on his way to help. And Franklin also tells Kitty about his nightmare here, and Kitty starts crying. And while Franklin thinks that's the reason, she's not crying because of the dream. She's crying because she's brought to tears from the kindness and sweet heart of Franklin Richards, even questioning why would he care so much. But Franklin seeing her cry, he tries to replicate the hand puppetry and story that Reed did for him to make him feel better, and it's just another adorable Franklin moment that melts your heart. And it's funny because he can't get his fingers to move like Reed's elastic fingers. And as the Fantastic Four are on their way, we learn that the team truly has regained their faith in Reed, but still his biggest hurdle is regaining faith in himself. He's worried he's going to make some error and it will cost Kitty her life. And then Franklin even astral projects to Reed, saying he told Kitty he's coming, showcasing his faith in Reed too, and even again as Reed doubts himself. And back in Latveria, the X-Men are getting pretty frustrated because Doom has promised his help, but there's seemingly a delay for some reason. But we do get Dr. Doom coming in and saying that finally the preparations are complete. And then we get this Magneto and Storm moment that I also really love in this series, and it's Magneto out on this cliff thinking about his past, and as Storm approaches, he points out that Auschwitz is 500 miles from them, a place where his parents and his sister met their end, and he has this outburst of power, thinking about all of the personal tragedies that he suffered, and he even laments that he's not with his family. And what he does is he grabs one of the Doombots all the way from over the castle with his magnetic powers, and he explains how rage and grief created Magneto, and then he morphs the metal of the Doombot into an image of Magda and his child, just thinking about a future where everything could have been okay with them. And then Doom has this projection where he yells at Magneto for using his magnetism powers while he's working with sensitive equipment, trying to help Kitty, and warns him not to do it again. And Storm tries to give Magneto some comfort here by saying, the past is the past, and what matters is who we are now and who we'll be tomorrow. And Magneto is trying to be better. Just then, they see the Fantastic Four arriving, and Magneto, fearing for the safety of Kitty's life due to Reed's interference, uses his powers to stop their jet, and Storm is like, dude, Magneto, Doom literally just warned you about your magnetic powers causing interference. And what we see back in the castle is, yes, this has created a problem, but Doom sees that the Fantastic Four has arrived and blames Reed for the dilemma. And basically, the X-Men are super skeptical of the Fantastic Four being there all of a sudden, and they're ready to fight because they think they may be here to stop Doom from assisting. And delivering on the promise of the title, we do get more fighting as Rogue, the Human Torch, the Thing, and Wolverine go at it once more, and the others join in the fray, and everyone has some pretty cool moments in this fight. I particularly like the She-Hulk telling Storm it's a pity she lost her powers because they could have had a good fight, and just when She-Hulk says that, lightning strikes behind Storm and we see the scared look in She-Hulk's eyes. But, so how does this fight stop? Well, our emotional button comes out, Franklin Richards, and is yelling at everyone, Kitty is dying and you're all out here fighting like fools, don't you care about the life of Kitty Pryde? And so the team stop fighting and approach the castle, and Doom mentions that this may be a good opportunity to prove once and for all in front of Reed that he's superior and can save Kitty. And if not, Kitty will die and Reed will be blamed. It's a win-win for him, but also Doom notices Reed clutching that journal, and Doom knows something about that journal actually, and he is very excited to see it come into play. And Doom is such a commanding presence here. He insults everybody for how shameful it is that a child had to be the one to pull them out of their bickering, and he even remarks that if their interruption hadn't occurred, he could have saved Kitty by now, which is perhaps true.
but perhaps a well-timed lie as well. But with that, Doom begins the process, and as Reed examines, he sees that Doom replicated his work, maybe even better than Reed could himself, and that self-doubt starts bubbling to the surface again. But just then, Reed notices a mistake in the data and demands Doom stop the process. And Reed and Doom start bickering over this, Doom saying that if Kitty dies, Reed will be punished to the full extent of the law, and Franklin, again, being the voice of reason for Kitty here, asks them to please stop yelling, and then even pleads with Dr. Doom, isn't saving Kitty more important than proving who's smarter, sort of calling out Doom for what he just said about the two teams fighting and bickering when Kitty's life is there and the most important thing. And with that, Doom gives Reed the go-ahead to try and determine if there are any errors in the process and whatnot, and basically Reed is like, okay, I'm gonna have to do this process manually, but he just can't get the diary out of his mind, he can't get that self-doubt out of his head. And Doom says, look, Reed, if you're so unsure about yourself, if you're so unsure that you may have written that, just have Psylocke read your mind and determine what the truth is, because it would be in there. And Psylocke is doing her best at the moment to keep Kitty together with her telepathic abilities, but Kitty is definitely on death's door, and the X-Men are freaking out, again just thinking about stealing Reed's abilities for the moment since he's so paralyzed by doubt. And Doom wants this to happen because he knows if that does happen, Reed will never believe in himself again, he'll never have faith in himself again, and Doom will always have an upper hand. But ultimately, Reed comes to the conclusion that the answer to who you are and how you are lies in the hearts of those you love, and it's just faith. That's all you need to answer the hardest questions. And then, everything is a blur for Reed, and we cut to a celebratory feast later. He was able to save Kitty, she is now in a stable condition, and the X-Men and Fantastic Four apologize to each other, Magneto and Reed make peace, but there is still one small lingering detail, that journal, and at this point, Sue has basically pieced together from observing Doom and Reed that Reed truly didn't write that journal, Doom did. It was a trap he laid years ago, waiting for someone to uncover, and this just happened to be that time. An attempt to use people as puppets to prove his superiority over Reed. And Sue has an awesome moment here where she threatens Doom and mentions that if things had gone Doom's way, well, it wouldn't have been quite a win for him, because an angry Sue is a power you do not want to mess with. And she really gets an amazing last dig at him, which is, but thankfully, there doesn't need to be a fight, because the Fantastic Four already won. And with that, we close out with a message about what's most important in life: faith, trust, and love. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe. Have a great rest of your day.